regarding the relationship between municipal self-government and Jewish communal autonomy. The cities of the empire were governed by magistracies, consisting of town councils, boards of aldermen, and municipal courts. Under the new regulations, Jews were to receive representation within these institutions in proportion to their numbers, in accordance with the general provisions of city administration. The common municipal courts, in which Jews were to be represented by elected jurymen from their own community, were granted jurisdiction over both civil and criminal cases. These courts were to adjudicate disputes not only between Christians and Jews, but also cases involving Jews alone. In this way, the authority of Jewish communal courts was significantly curtailed. The Jewish kahals, both at the district level and at the level of provincial government, were restricted to spiritual and religious matters. Their administrative functions were reduced. They were charged primarily with the assessment and distribution of state taxes and communal levies among Jewish households, a role that preserved their usefulness to the state while limiting their independence. When it came to the many complaints raised by Jews concerning abuses by local administrators, municipal authorities, and landowners, the Senate offered little concrete relief. It merely reiterated the general principle that all members of a given social estate were entitled to the rights associated with that estate. In a striking declaration, the Senate even prohibited references to the former Polish laws that had discriminated against Jews. Since Jews were now enrolled among the merchant and burgher estates, paid equal taxes to the imperial treasury, and were legally classified alongside non-Jews, they were, in theory, entitled to equal protection and redress in all circumstances. Yet even as it proclaimed this principle of equality, the Senate revealed its limits. In the very same ukase, it denied the petition of several White Russian Jews who sought admission to the Merchant Corporation of Riga, a powerful commercial guild in the important Baltic port city. The refusal was justified by the absence of a special imperial permit authorizing Jews to register as merchants outside the territory of White Russia. Thus, equality was affirmed in words but constrained by geography, bureaucracy, and unspoken prejudice, leaving Jewish rights suspended between promise and denial. In the latter decades of the 18th century, the shadow of Russian autocracy began to stretch ominously over the lives of Jews in the territories it acquired from the dismembered Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Here, we see the first application of a principle that would mark the centuries to come, that everything was forbidden to Jews unless expressly permitted by a special law. In the year 1786, an imperial decree, an ukase, issued under the reign of Empress Catherine II, proclaimed with lofty phrases about the equality of all subjects regardless of religion. Yet beneath this veneer of liberalism lay a quiet but inexorable tethering of Jewish life. The decree effectively confined Jewish populations to certain territories wrested from Poland, prefiguring the formal institution of the Pale of Settlement. Jews were forbidden to reside freely outside these areas, creating a legal and social cage that the Russian authorities would only tighten in the decades ahead. The Senate of St. Petersburg, in its cautious critique of the former Polish laws, claimed to remedy the discriminations Jews had suffered under Polish rule. Yet the harsh reality was that Russian law would far exceed the Polish restrictions, curtailing the movement and commerce of Jews to a degree unimagined even by Poland's most zealous restrictionists. Initially, in the first 20 years following the Russian occupation of White Russia, territories corresponding to the present governments of Mogilev and Vitebsk, the attitude of the Russian authorities was comparatively tolerant, even well-intentioned. Jews could carry on business, settle in towns, and navigate the economic life of the region with a degree of freedom. But the currents of reaction were rising. The tremors of the French Revolution, beginning in the year 1789, reached St. Petersburg and stirred fear among Russian elites. The reign of Catherine II, which ended in 1796, had already witnessed a tightening of control, and the status of Jews became increasingly precarious. The second and third partitions of Poland, in the years 1793 and 1795 respectively, transferred hundreds of thousands of Jews from the provinces of Lithuania, Volhynia, and Podolia into the dominion of the Russian Empire. This created an urgent dilemma: how could a government that had scarcely tolerated a single Jew for generations suddenly incorporate millions into its population? The answer, as it often was in Russian policy, was the codification of Jewish powerlessness. A system of legal restrictions, of rights withheld rather than granted, emerged to reconcile these historic opposites: the presence of millions of Jews on the one hand, and the traditional Muscovite policy of exclusion on the other. The Pale of Settlement, formalized in the years following these annexations, was the instrument of this policy. Within the vast monarchy of peasant serfs, Jews were transformed into a distinct class of territorially restricted city serfs. The initiative, it is worth noting, did not come solely from the imperial throne. Influential Christian merchants, fearing competition from enterprising Jewish traders, clamored for protection and were instrumental in shaping the restrictions. The first steps to curtail Jewish freedom of movement took root in White Russia a few years after the Russian occupation. Merchants from the White Russian governments of Mogilev and Polotsk, or Vitebsk as it is called today, began to travel to cities within the great Russian governments of Smolensk and Moscow, trading in imported dry goods at prices far lower than those set by their Christian competitors. Their success, however, provoked outrage. In February of the year 1790, Moscow merchants formally petitioned the commander-in-chief of the city, complaining that the Jews, by selling foreign goods by lowering the current prices, were inflicting severe damage on local commerce. They invoked the ancient Muscovite tradition of excluding Jews altogether, warning that continued competition would throw Moscow trade into complete disorder and bring local merchants to ruin. The petition found sympathetic ears within government circles, and the imperial authorities acted swiftly. By the autumn of the same year, the Council of State, having reviewed a counter-petition by the Jews requesting enrollment in the merchant corporations of Smolensk and Moscow, ruled that such enrollment was not found to be of any benefit. The verdict was reaffirmed a year later by an imperial ukase, dated December 23, 1791, declaring that Jews had no right to join the merchant corporations of inner Russian cities or ports of entry. They were permitted only the rights of townsmen and burghers within White Russia. In an attempt at mitigation, the decree extended this limited privilege to the Viceroyalty of Yekaterinoslav and to the region of Tavrida, territories recently annexed in the south, known collectively as New Russia. Here, the imperial administration hoped to populate the empty steppes with industrious settlers. Thus began the systematic restriction of Jewish life in the Russian Empire. A world in which legal permission, rather than natural freedom, defined the boundaries of existence. It was a quiet tyranny, one wrapped in bureaucratic rationales, but it marked the beginning of an era in which millions of people would live not as citizens but as subjects, forever measured by the lines drawn on a map rather than by their deeds or character. Thus, through a stroke of imperial legislation, the first territorial ghetto of the Russian Empire came into being. It was established in the lands then known as White Russia, a broad region inhabited largely by Slavic peoples and newly absorbed by the empire from the dismembered Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This space was not created to protect the Jewish population, but to contain it. It was designed as a legal enclosure, meant to harbor the Jews who had suddenly become subjects of the Russian crown after the first partition of Poland, an event that tore vast territories away from a once powerful state and redistributed them among its neighbors. 2 years later, history repeated its violence. In the year 1793, the second partition of Poland further dismantled that weakened kingdom. With it, the ghetto was expanded again, stretching outward like a tightening net. To the northwest, it absorbed the government of Minsk, an administrative province organized under Russian rule. To the southwest, it swallowed Volhynia, a fertile and populous land, along with most of the Kiev province and the region of Podolaya. These lands had long been home to Jewish communities, rooted there for generations. Now they were formally enclosed within a single, defined zone. On the 23rd day of June in the year 1794, an imperial decree, known as a ukase, gave this expanded territory the full sanction of law. A ukase was not merely an announcement, it was the direct voice of the sovereign, carrying unquestionable authority. This decree formally defined what would come to be known as the Pale of Settlement, a vast but restrictive zone in which Jews were permitted to live. Within this pale, Jews were granted specific and carefully limited rights. They were allowed to engage in the occupations of merchants and burghers, meaning registered townspeople, in a long list of named provinces: the government of Minsk, the government of Izyaslav, later renamed Volhynia, the government of Bratslav, which formed the core of Podolaya, the government of Polotsk, later known as Vitebsk, the governments of Mogilev, Kiev, Chernigov, and Novgorod-Seversk, the southern province of Yekaterinoslav, and finally the region of Tavrida, which included the Crimean Peninsula and surrounding lands along the Black Sea. By this act, the Pale was extended even further, now embracing what was called Little Russia, a historical term used by the Russian state to describe large parts of what is now Ukraine. This included territories that had been taken from Poland as early as the year 1654, during earlier wars and treaties. Ironically, these were precisely the lands from which Jews had been relentlessly expelled beyond the frontier during the reigns of the three empresses who ruled before Catherine the Great. For decades, policy had driven them out. Now policy compelled their containment. The Russian government found itself trapped by geography and history. Little Russia was organically connected to the Ukrainian lands on the right bank of the Dnieper River, which had just been annexed from Poland. Jews had lived in these regions from time immemorial, embedded in trade, crafts, and local life. To uproot them entirely would have been administratively impossible and economically disastrous. Reluctantly, the state allowed them to remain, but only within the boundaries it now imposed. Even the ancient and revered city of Kiev, regarded as a holy city of Eastern Christianity and long closed to Jews, opened its gates under this new order. With that decision, the Dnieper River, one of the great waterways of Eastern Europe, flowing from the north to the Black Sea, became the central artery of the Jewish Pale of Settlement, binding together its northern and southern reaches. The final act came swiftly. In the year 1795, the Third Partition of Poland erased what little remained of that once mighty state. With it, the Pale expanded yet again, now incorporating the basin of the Niemen River and the historic land of Lithuania. This included the governments of Grodno and Vilna, regions renowned for their Jewish learning, commerce, and dense Jewish population. With this annexation, the process of forming the Pale of Settlement was complete. By the end of the 18th century, the boundaries had hardened into a permanent structure. Beyond them lay Eastern Russia, which remained as firmly closed to Jews as it had been in the days of the old Muscovite Empire, vigilant and suspicious, guarding itself against what it called the penetration of the Jewish element. Yet the same decree of 1794 that defined where Jews might live also imposed how they were to live. It established a second, equally fundamental discrimination: taxation. Jews who wished to enroll as merchants or burghers in the cities were required to pay taxes at twice the rate imposed on Christian merchants and townspeople. This was not a temporary levy, but a permanent mark of inequality written into law. Those Jews who refused to accept these conditions, who did not wish to remain in the cities under the burden of double taxation, were ordered to leave the Russian Empire altogether. Before departing, they were compelled to pay a punitive fine equal to 3 years of this doubled tax. Thus, the state extracted a heavy price simply for the privilege of remaining in one's ancestral home, while denying Jews the freedom of movement enjoyed by Christian townspeople, who could travel freely throughout the empire. This crushing tax did not even purchase relief from other obligations. Jews were still subject to a special military assessment, imposed by decrees issued in 1794 and again in 1796. Like the broader Russian mercantile class, they paid this tax in exchange for exemption from personal military service. In effect, they paid more, received less, and remained under constant legal pressure. Amid this harsh system, one striking exception appeared. At the urging of Count Platon Zubov, a powerful favorite at the imperial court and governor-general of New Russia, the Karaites of the government of Tavrida were released from the burden of double taxation. The Karaites were a small religious group who followed a form of Judaism that rejected the Talmud and rabbinic tradition, relying solely on the Hebrew Bible. For centuries, they had lived apart from the broader Jewish community. By an ukase issued on the 8th day of June in the year 1795, the Karaites were granted permission to own landed estates and were, in general, placed on equal legal footing with the Christian population. But this equality came with a chilling condition. It was explicitly stated that the Karaite community must not admit Jews known as rabbins, meaning Rabbanites, the mainstream Jews who followed rabbinic law. Against these Jews, the decree insisted, the existing laws were to be rigidly enforced. Here, the true motive of the anti-Jewish legislation revealed itself with brutal clarity. A tiny group, separated from Jewish tradition and identity, was deemed more desirable and trustworthy than the Jewish people as a whole. The authentic bearers of Jewish religious and communal life were to be subdued through repression, while those who stood apart were rewarded. This same spirit animated another decree issued in 1795. It ordered that Jews living in villages be formally registered in towns and that efforts be made to transfer them into district towns. The official language claimed benevolent intent. These people, it said, should not wander about, but should instead engage in commerce, promote manufacturing, and practice handicrafts, thereby advancing both their own interests and those of society. In reality, this decree merely legalized a long-standing abuse. Local authorities had for years expelled Jews from villages at will, claiming that Jews could be registered only as townspeople. Now this arbitrary practice received the stamp of imperial law. Families were driven from their homes, stripped of their livelihoods, and sent into overcrowded towns already struggling with poverty. For these expelled families, ruin was inevitable. The command to engage in trade or craftsmanship did not conjure customers, capital, or opportunity. Even established merchants and artisans in the towns often failed to survive. The state's heavy-handed supervision, presented as guidance and reform, only tightened the chains around Jewish economic life. Instead of fostering development, official tutelage stifled initiative, crushed stability, and deepened despair, setting the stage for further tension and suffering still to come. In the closing years of the 18th century, the Russian administration continued to experiment with the control of Jewish life, and in doing so it tightened the bonds of the old system. The Kahal, the Jewish communal self-government that had long served as a bridge between the community and the state, was now being reshaped to serve only the needs of the government. The Jews were to be governed, not integrated. In 1795, the old edict was repeated. The government and district kahals, which had been permitted to participate in city administration and to serve in the magistracies and town councils, were to be stripped of their social and judicial functions. They were to be allowed to concern themselves only with religious ceremonies and divine service, the rituals of worship. In theory, Jews were granted participation in municipal government, but in practice their involvement was weak, because the Christian burghers, the townspeople, were hostile and obstructive. The kahals, however, were preserved for fiscal purposes. For the sake of the treasury, the government needed a centralized system to collect taxes, and the kahal, though weakened and disorganized, continued to serve as the instrument of Jewish communal autonomy. Thus, by the end of Catherine II's reign, restrictive legislation against the Jews had become firmly established. A Muscovite wall, a barrier separating the western provinces from the eastern heartland of Russia, had been erected. Even within the restricted area where Jews were allowed to live, there was a growing tendency to further narrow their space. By forcing Jews out of villages and compressing them into towns and cities, the government sought to concentrate and control the Jewish masses. It was a policy of containment, and it would be the task of Catherine's successors to make it law. Yet among these harsh measures, there was one solitary reform, though it was only a verbal one. In the legislative enactments of the last decade of Catherine's reign, the contemptuous term zhyd, the slur used for Jews, was replaced by the word Hebrew, or Yevri in Russian. The government could not bring itself to go beyond this mere change of terminology. The name was changed, but the reality remained. Then came the brief reign of Paul I, from 1796 to 1801. In the field of Jewish legislation, his rule added little of consequence. The law imposing a double tax on Jews was confirmed, and the other restrictions remained in force. Yet the empire expanded, and with expansion came new questions of administration. In 1795, the government annexed the Duchy of Courland, on the western edge of the empire. In this territory, several thousand Jews lived, tolerated as foreigners in the German fashion, with only partial communal organization. The question arose, how should the government collect taxes from the itinerant chapmen, the traveling peddlers and merchants who made up the bulk of the Jewish population there? These men were not registered among the rural or urban estates and were not affiliated with Jewish communities. In 1799, the Russian government solved the problem by placing the Jews of Courland in the same position as their coreligionists in other western provinces. They were granted the right to enroll themselves among the mercantile or burgher estates, and to establish their own kahals. In this case, fiscal considerations once again dictated the organization of Jewish life, this time in the domain of the German barons. Having confined the Jewish population within the western pale of settlement, the government could not very well restrict freedom of transit within that pale, at least in terms of moving from city to city. Many Jews from impoverished White Russia took advantage of this right. They began to emigrate internally into the provinces of Little Russia, especially into the region known as Novgorod-Seversk, later reorganized as the government of Poltava. These areas were more prosperous and less crowded with Jews. The government, aware of this internal migration, could not ignore it. Merchants were allowed to move freely from White Russia into Little Russia. Burghers, however, were permitted to emigrate only under conditions that applied to all persons of the taxable estates. They had to obtain certificates of dismissal. This rule was imposed in December of 1796. Though Paul I's reign produced little concrete legislation concerning Jews, it was rich in preliminary measures that laid the groundwork for future policy. His reign was filled with projects and official investigations aimed at regulating the status of the Jews. From 1797 to 1800, government offices were feverishly engaged in this work, seeking to understand the condition of the former Polish provinces and especially the situation of the Jewish population. The first step toward knowledge was a circular inquiry sent to the nobles and higher officials of the region. The stimulus for this inquiry came in 1797 from a report concerning the famine raging in the government of Minsk. Governor Kornyev of Minsk received orders from St. Petersburg to gather the opinions of the local marshals of nobility, the leaders of the nobility in each district, and to provide an explanation of the causes of the peasants' impoverishment, along with plans for their amelioration. In this way, the Russian state began to probe the social and economic realities of the newly acquired territories. The Jewish question, entangled with the fate of the peasants and the interests of the nobility, was drawn into a vast imperial investigation. The stage was set for a new phase of control, where the lives of millions would be shaped not by their own communities but by the bureaucratic machinery of a distant empire. The authorities believed they had found a clever instrument for uncovering the causes of rural misery. They summoned the landed aristocracy themselves and asked them why the peasant serfs under their control had fallen into such deep poverty. It was a question heavy with implication, and it carried the faint hope that the truth might surface through the words of those who held power over the land and the people who worked it. The answer, however, unfolded with grim predictability. The Polish magnates, wealthy noble landowners who gathered in the city of Minsk at the invitation of the imperial government, did not for even a fleeting moment consider that the suffering of the peasants might have anything to do with their own practices as masters of vast estates worked by bound labor. These men belonged to the old aristocracy of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, accustomed for generations to ruling over serfs whose lives, labor, and movement were tightly controlled. To accuse themselves would have meant questioning the very foundations of their authority. Instead, blame was carefully redirected. Part of it, they claimed, lay with impersonal forces beyond anyone's control, political disturbances and uprisings in the province, the lingering unrest that followed the recent partitions of Poland, harvests ruined by unfavorable weather, and the poor condition of roads and transport, which made it difficult to bring goods to market. These explanations sounded reasonable, even responsible. But they did not stop there. A second and more pointed accusation was aimed at the Jews living on their estates. These Jews were often employed by landowners as leaseholders, known as arendars, and as tavern keepers in villages. According to the nobles, this arrangement violated existing government regulations that restricted Jewish residents primarily to towns and cities. The magnates painted a dark picture. Jewish tavern keepers, they claimed, tempted the peasants into drunkenness, selling them spirits on credit, trapping them in debt, and thus rendering them incapable of managing their households or fulfilling their obligations. The solution proposed by the nobility was presented as an act of concern for the peasants' moral and economic health. To save the rural population, the government, they insisted, should decree that the right to distill alcoholic spirits be granted exclusively to landowners. This privilege was to be denied not only to Jews, but also to any other leaseholders or tavern keepers. In village public houses, permission to sell strong distilled liquor, especially whiskey, should belong only to the squires themselves. In simpler terms, the peasants would supposedly prosper and regain their capacity for orderly life if they drank alcohol sold directly by their noble masters rather than by Jewish intermediaries. The drink itself did not change, only the hands that profited from it. No profound political insight was required to recognize the true motive hidden beneath this moralizing language. The nobles were fighting to preserve an ancient economic privilege, the monopoly over alcohol production and sale, known under the old Polish system as the right of propination. This right had allowed landowners to compel their peasants to buy and consume alcohol produced on the estate, turning drunkenness into a steady source of profit. The fall of Polish rule and the incorporation of these lands into the Russian Empire had placed this privilege under threat, and the nobles were determined to defend it. Despite the transparent self-interest behind these arguments, the governor of Minsk forwarded the report of the nobility to the ruler of the Russian Empire. At that time, the throne was occupied by Tsar Paul I, son of Empress Catherine II. On the 28th day of July in the year 1797, the Tsar wrote his resolution. He ordered that measures be taken, in accordance with the proposals of the marshals of the nobility, to restrict the rights of the Jews, whom the nobles accused of ruining the peasants. Almost simultaneously, the governing Senate, the highest administrative and judicial body of the empire, reminded the governor of an earlier decree issued by Catherine II. This decree had ordered that Jews be transferred to district towns, so that, in the language of the law, they might not wander about to the detriment of society. Together, these instructions amounted to an open-ended authorization for local officials to expel Jews from villages and rural settlements, dramatically narrowing the space in which they were permitted to live and work. The following year, in 1798, the initiative passed to the nobility of the southwestern provinces of the empire, particularly Volhynia and Podolaya, regions with large Jewish populations and vast noble estates. Their representatives, the marshals of the nobility, assembled in the fortified city of Kamenets, a historic administrative center of Podolaya. There, they drafted a program even more sweeping than the one proposed in Minsk. They began with carefully chosen words of loyalty and gratitude, thanking the Tsar for his imperial benevolence in allowing them to retain the franchise of liquor dealing. Having established this tone of devotion, they pressed their demands further. Neither the right to distill alcohol nor the right to sell it, they argued, should be leased to Jews, or even to Christian commoners. Instead, the nobles themselves should enjoy complete freedom to employ whomever they wished in their public houses, entirely at their own discretion. Having secured, at least in theory, the monopoly on intoxicating the rural population through their own hired bartenders, the nobles turned to a broader reorganization of Jewish life. They proposed that the majority of Jews be transformed into agents for export trade, tasked with finding foreign markets for agricultural products grown on noble estates. In this arrangement, commercial profits, they claimed, would flow both to the cultivators of the soil and to the noble landowners, though the balance of benefit was left conveniently vague. As for the remaining Jews, the plan divided them sharply. Some would be retained by landowners to work in public houses under noble control. The rest would be compelled to take up agriculture or manual trades, regardless of their previous occupations, resources, or inclinations. What was presented as reform was, in reality, a far-reaching attempt to reshape an entire community into instruments of aristocratic economic interest. For the Jews themselves, this vision of the future held little appeal. To become agents selling estate produce abroad, or attendants in taverns stripped of independence, or forced laborers in unfamiliar fields and crafts, meant the loss of what limited autonomy they still possessed. Alarm spread through Jewish communities in Volhynia and Podolaya as these plans became known. In response, Jewish leaders convened consultations and resolved to act collectively. During the summer of 1798, a conference of delegates gathered in the town of Ostrog, in Volhynia. Ostrog was an important center of Jewish learning and religious life, deeply influenced by Hasidism, a spiritual movement that emphasized devotion, mysticism, and communal cohesion. There, the delegates decided to raise funds and send a deputation to the imperial capital, St. Petersburg, to present directly to the Tsar the needs and wishes of the Jews of the southwestern provinces. They had not been consulted in the planning of their own future, and they intended, at least, to make their voices heard. These preparations did not go unnoticed. The Governor-General of the Southwest, Count Ivan Gudavish, a powerful military and civil administrator, learned of the planned collection of money. Suspicion came swiftly. In the mindset of the age, any independent Jewish initiative could be construed as dangerous. Gudavish convinced himself that the fundraising might merely serve as a cover for some wicked and secret Jewish design. Acting on this fear, he ordered the confiscation of the money already collected, prohibited any further collections, and proudly reported his decisive action to the authorities in St. Petersburg. The response he received was not the one he expected. To his evident astonishment, the Tsar replied that he found nothing criminal in the desire of the Jews to send a deputation to him. In September of 1798, Gudavish was instructed to return the confiscated funds and to refrain from interfering with the mission of the delegates. Whether the deputation ultimately reached the capital, and what effect, if any, it had on imperial policy, remains unknown. Yet the episode itself reveals something striking. Even in an age marked by limited enlightenment, and within the inward-looking, deeply religious Hasidic communities of Volhynia and Podolaya, Jews were not wholly detached from the political and social transformations unfolding around them in the Russian Empire. The final voices to reach the ears of the imperial government in its sweeping inquiry into the conditions of the Jewish population were those of the Lithuanian nobility, a class whose power and privileges had been carved over centuries of political maneuvering and feudal custom. In the year 1800, the marshals, the chief administrators and representatives of the 19 distinct Lithuanian districts, convened in solemn assembly. They submitted their official opinion to Baron Jan Friesel, the governor of the city of Vilna, a man of cultivated German education, well versed in the debates over Jewish policy in the courts and academies of Western Europe. This opinion, remarkable for its near unanimity, was approved by the assembly with only 3 dissenting voices. The few who opposed, 3 marshals who clung to tradition, argued that the Jewish population should remain in the status quo, continuing as they had under the former Polish regime, with its complex mixture of toleration, restriction, and autonomous Jewish administration. The overwhelming majority, however, drafted a vision that was far more radical than anything proposed by their counterparts in Minsk or the southern province of Podolaya. These Lithuanian nobles, with the fervor of reformers who imagined themselves shaping the destiny of an entire people, proposed a sweeping restructuring of Jewish economic life. The Jews were to be barred not only from distilling spirits and operating taverns of their own but from selling alcohol even in the public houses that operated on manorial estates. Those among the Jewish rural population who relied on these trades for their livelihood were to be uprooted from their villages, forcibly moved partly to the growing urban centers, partly dispersed across crown lands and private estates, where they might be permitted, under strict supervision, to cultivate grains, mortgage, or lease properties. Yet the reformers did not stop at economics. They cast their eyes on the very fabric of Jewish identity. The Lithuanian marshals, steeped in the prejudices and aspirations of their era, insisted that Jewish attire be abolished, that traditional garments, symbols of a centuries-old cultural and religious identity, be replaced with the clothing worn by their Christian neighbors. Their logic was simple but ruthless. The separateness of the Jewish people must be broken. The marshals described this separateness as complete, a people unto themselves, governed not only by synagogues but by the kahals, autonomous councils which wielded both spiritual and civil authority, even intervening in police matters. The goal was assimilation by coercion, a deliberate and systematic erasure of Jewish autonomy and community organization. Baron Jan Friesel, the governor of Vilna, pressed the Lithuanian marshals to clarify their position. He was a man of intellect and cultural sophistication, well aware of Jewish reforms attempted in Germany, and he found their initial proposals unsatisfactory. Only after a second, more detailed statement, which included the internal reforms of dress, education, and social structure, did Friesel approve the recommendations. In April of the year 1800, he sent these proposals to the Imperial Senate in St. Petersburg, accompanied by a memorandum of his own. This memorandum drew heavily upon plans first laid out a decade earlier by scholars Chatsky and Butrimovic, who had submitted detailed proposals to the Jewish Commission of the Quadrennial Diet, a legislative body convened to deliberate on issues affecting the Jewish population in the Polish-Lithuanian territories under Russian administration. Friesel advocated what he termed a general reform, taking Western Europe as his model in theory, yet implementing only the harshest instruments of enlightened absolutism. In his view, the reformation of Jewish society must begin with religion itself. He called for the eradication of all Jewish sects and their superstitions, a clear reference to the Hasidic movement, whose charismatic leaders, the Tzaddiks, had already drawn the attention and concern of the Russian authorities through their conflicts with the anti-Hasidic rabbinical establishment. The reform required that Jewish children be compelled to attend government schools, that all commercial and civic transactions be conducted in the Polish language, that traditional dress be abandoned, and that marriage not occur before the age of 20. Finally, the population was to be divided into 3 rigid classes: merchants, artisans, and tillers of the soil. These new divisions were intended to dissolve the power of the kahals, whose fiscal and administrative authority would naturally wither away under this reorganization. These recommendations, both from the Lithuanian nobility and from Governor Friesel, were then forwarded to the Senate in the spring of 1800. Fate would intervene in the form of Senator Gabriel Dyer-Javin, a man whose life had been largely devoted to the bureaucratic corridors of St. Petersburg. Born in one of the remote eastern provinces of Russia, he had spent his career in civil service and had no previous contact with Jewish communities. In the year 1799, however, he was dispatched to the town of Shklov in White Russia, a settlement under the proprietorship of a retired general named Zorik. General Zorik, once a favorite of Empress Catherine the Great, lived the extravagant life of a Russian country squire, asserting absolute control over the town as if it were his personal fief. His methods of governance were harsh, treating the Jewish population as if they were serfs bound to his land. Some were expelled from their homes, others beaten, and still others compelled to provide him with drink at no cost. The Jewish residents appealed directly to the imperial government, seeking protection against this arbitrary tyranny. Emperor Paul, recognizing the threat to order, instructed Senator Dyerzhavin to intervene. Yet Dyerzhavin, himself steeped in the ethos of serfdom and the hierarchies of Russian society, took a surprisingly lenient view of Zorik's abuses. He concluded that the Jewish inhabitants were, in part, responsible for the disturbances. The sudden death of General Zorik in the year 1800 brought the case to an abrupt end, but the Senate issued a formal pronouncement. According to Russian law, Jews, by virtue of their classification as members of the merchant and burgher classes, could not be regarded as serfs, even in towns and estates held by private owners. The stage was thus set for a new chapter in the administration and attempted reformation of Jewish life under Russian rule, one that would blend high-minded theory with coercive enforcement, laying the groundwork for tensions that would ripple through communities for decades. A year later, in the early months of the year 1800, Gavril Romanovich Dyerzhavin, a prominent senator and trusted servant of the Russian crown, was dispatched once more to the province of White Russia. This time, he arrived bearing vast and almost unlimited powers. White Russia, a land of rolling plains and dense forests, was gripped by a terrible famine. The people, mostly peasants tied to the land through the system of serfdom, faced starvation not merely because of failed harvests, but also because of the reckless greed of the landed proprietors. These were the gentlemen of the estates, the Polish and Russian nobility who controlled the villages, and instead of distributing grain to feed the peasants who worked their fields, they sent large quantities abroad for sale, or to distilleries to be converted into whiskey, a potent drink that intoxicated and poisoned rather than nourished. Emperor Paul I, whose reign was marked by both sudden impulses and rigid enforcement, entrusted Dyerzhavin with the task of putting an end to these abuses. By an imperial ukase dated the 16th day of June in the year 1800, Dyerzhavin was empowered to impose severe penalties on these unruly squires. Their estates, the decree warned, were to be confiscated and placed under state control if they persisted in leaving their peasants destitute and helpless. Yet alongside these instructions came a chilling postscript, added by the Procurator General of the Senate, a high-ranking official named Abelenin. In it, he wrote that, according to reports received at the highest levels of government, a significant portion of the famine's devastation could be attributed to the Jews, referred to in the document as ZHYDS, a term now recognized as an offensive designation. Abelenin instructed Dyerzhavin to give particular attention to this alleged role and to submit his opinion on how to avert the damage supposedly inflicted by them. This unmistakably anti-Jewish directive, which Dyerzhavin likely endorsed or even helped shape, transformed his mission from a campaign against the greedy landed nobility into a vehicle for scapegoating the Jewish population. A subtle conspiracy between two bureaucrats, one devoted to upholding serfdom, the other aligned with aristocratic interests, recast the mission entirely, turning the blow away from the squires and toward the Jews. Dyerzhavin's pacification of White Russia was swift and decisive. He placed the estate of a Polish magnate directly under state control and personally shut down a Jewish distillery in the town of Lozno, a settlement notable as the residence of the renowned Hasidic Tzaddik, Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, a spiritual leader respected for his piety and wisdom. His actions were executed with such force and urgency that complaints reached the authorities. One Jewish woman claimed to have been struck by Dyerzhavin himself. After establishing order according to his standards, he turned to what he regarded as his principal task, the preparation of an elaborate memorandum concerning the Jews. The document, with its grandiose title, Opinion of Senator Dyerzhavin concerning the averting of the want of foodstuffs in White Russia by curbing the avaricious pursuits of the Jews, also concerning their re-education, and other matters, betrays its true intention from the outset. The economic calamity of the province was to be blamed upon the Jewish population, absolving the squires of their long-standing responsibility. Yet Dyer-Javan's interest extended far beyond mere economics. He sought to map the inner life of the Jewish communities, examining their religious beliefs, educational practices, communal institutions, and what he called their moral situation. To gather information, he drew upon an array of sources: anti-Jewish merchants and burghers in the towns, instructors at the Jesuit College of Vitebsk, court records, and, astonishingly, even the Cossacks themselves, semi-military communities known for their fierce independence and deep suspicion of outsiders. In addition to these local testimonies, Dyer-Javan considered the proposals of a few enlightened Jews, men who sought reform and advancement for their communities. One was Nota Shklover, a wealthy merchant who had served as purveyor to the army of Prince Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin, the famous statesman and general who had expanded Russian influence across the Black Sea region. Shklover, residing in the imperial capital of St. Petersburg at the time, suggested that Jews be drawn into manufacturing, which could be combined with agriculture and livestock breeding in colonies specially established near the Black Sea ports. The plan envisioned the Jews as productive citizens contributing directly to the economic strength of the empire. A second project came from a physician named Frank, living in Kreslovka, a settlement in the government of Vitebsk. He appeared to be a German Jew influenced by the ideas of Moses Mendelssohn, the philosopher of the German Enlightenment. Frank proposed that the Russian state focus on reforming Jewish religious practice, returning it to its supposed original purity of unadulterated deism and universal morality, which he believed had been corrupted over the centuries by the complexities and absurdities of the Talmud. Frank envisioned a system in which Jewish children would be admitted to public schools and taught Russian, German, and Hebrew, producing a generation that would be educated in state-approved disciplines and thus useful to the empire. In addition to these visionary proposals, Dyer-Javan had before him specimens of several Prussian Judenreglements, official regulations from German principalities concerning Jewish populations, as well as recommendations from marshals and governors across Western Russia. Although Dyer-Javan had only glimpsed the Jewish communities of White Russia during his hurried inspection, this amassed collection of documents, reports, and testimonies allowed him to construct a sweeping memorandum. It demanded a complete transformation of Jewish life economically, socially, and spiritually, through the lens of imperial control and bureaucratic oversight, cementing the Jews' role as the targets of administrative intervention in the empire. The portrait of Jewish life painted by Dyer-Javan is dark, and it is also deeply misleading. His description reveals not only ignorance but a kind of willful distortion, as if he were determined to see the Jewish community through a lens of prejudice. In his eyes, the Jews' economic pursuits, trading, leasing land, running inns, acting as brokers, are not honest work but subtle devices designed to squeeze wealth from their neighbors. The school, the center of Jewish learning, is dismissed as a hotbed of superstitions. Moral sentiments, he claims, are absent among Jews. They have no conception of loving-kindness, disinterestedness, or any virtue. All they do, he asserts, is collect riches either to build a new temple of Solomon or to satisfy their fleshly desires. This strange and bitter caricature serves as the prelude to a sweeping reform plan, an 88-clause scheme for the transformation of the Jews. It is a plan that seeks to remake an entire people by bureaucratic decree. Dyer-Javan proposes that the Jews be placed under supreme protection and tutelage, meaning direct imperial control. A special Christian official, a protector, would be appointed to supervise them. This protector would be assisted by committees appointed by the gubernatorial administrations, the regional authorities. Their task would be to carry out the transformation, to take a census of all Jews, and to provide them with family names, an act of control and classification. Then the Jews would be divided into 4 categories: merchants, urban burghers, rural burghers, and agricultural settlers. Every Jew would be forced to register in one of these categories. They would be evenly distributed across the various parts of White Russia, and any surplus population would be transferred to other provinces. Once this reform was completed, the kahals would be abolished. In their place, synagogues with rabbis and schoolmen would be organized in the different provinces. To govern religious affairs, a supreme ecclesiastic tribunal would be established in St. Petersburg, called the Sanhedrin, a term modeled on the Jewish Sanhedrin of ancient times. It would be presided over by a chief rabbi, or patriarch, after the example of the Muslim mufti among the Tatars. Dyer-Javan's plan also included a series of repressive and compulsory measures. Jews would be forbidden to employ Christian servants. They would lose the right to participate in city magistracies. They would be forced to abandon their distinctive dress and to conduct all business and legal documents in Russian, Polish, or German. Children would attend Jewish religious schools only until the age of 12, after which they would be transferred to state secular schools. Finally, Dyerzhavin proposed that the government establish its own printing press to publish Jewish religious books with philosophic annotations. In his view, this would help set the stubborn and cunning tribe of Hebrews properly to rights. He claimed that Emperor Paul, by carrying out this reform, would earn great fame for fulfilling the Christian commandment, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you." Such was Dyerzhavin's project. It was a curious mixture of savage Muscovite fantasies about an unfamiliar culture and the rigid, military spirit of contemporary Prussian reform. It combined hereditary Jew hatred with a vague appreciation of Judaism's historic tragedy, and a desire to render the Jews useful to the state. Over the entire scheme hovered the spirit of official patronage and red tape regulations, the belief that a people with an ancient culture could be rearranged by the mere bidding of an outside agency, like pieces on a chessboard. It was a faith in the saving power of mechanical reforms, a faith that, though less naive in other parts of Europe, still shaped the policies of the time. Dyerzhavin's opinion was presented to the Senate in December of 1800. Along with the recommendations of the West Russian marshals and governors, it was intended to form the basis for an organic legal enactment concerning the Jews. But this plan was not destined to be realized during the reign of Paul. In March of 1801, the Tsar met a tragic fate, assassinated in a palace coup. The cause of Jewish reform then entered a new phase, one marked by the clash between the liberal tendencies that emerged at the beginning of Alexander I's reign and the retrograde views held by the defenders of Old Poland and Old Russia. In the shadows of this conflict, the future of the Jewish population would be shaped, not by their own hopes and efforts, but by the competing visions of reformers and reactionaries, each seeking to use the Jewish question to serve the needs of the state. Behind the official decrees and polished reports of the Russian Empire lay a dense web of ideas, experiments, and inherited prejudices, stretching back decades before the dramatic events now unfolding. More than 30 years earlier, in the year 1766, Empress Catherine II, later remembered as Catherine the Great, had convened an ambitious legislative assembly. This body, known as the Legislative Commission, was composed of representatives from the various estates of Russian society, the nobility, the townspeople, the clergy, and other legally defined social groups. Its task was nothing less than the creation of a new and comprehensive code of laws for the empire. To guide this effort, Catherine herself composed a document that became famous throughout Europe, the Instruction, known in Russian as the Nakaz. In this text, she laid out her vision of government, justice, and social order, drawing heavily on the ideas of the French political philosopher Charles de Montesquieu, whose writings emphasized rational law, balance of power, and the supposed spirit of nations. Although the Commission ultimately failed to produce a new legal code, the Nakaz left a lasting imprint on Russian administrative thinking and provided ideological justification for later reforms. One such reform reshaped the territorial structure of the empire. A new law divided the vast lands ruled by the Russian crown into administrative units called governments, known in Russian as gubernii. The word itself echoed the French term gouvernement, reflecting the influence of Western European administrative models. Each government was placed under the authority of a governor, or gubernator, appointed by the central power. In especially sensitive or strategically important regions, usually along the borders of the empire, several governments were grouped together under a higher official, the Governor-General, or General Gubernator. These men wielded enormous power, combining military command with civil authority, and their decisions could shape the fate of entire populations. Urban society was also carefully classified by law. City dwellers were divided into distinct estates, each with its own rights and obligations. At the top stood the merchants, individuals possessing substantial capital and engaged in large-scale trade. Below them were the burghers, known in Russian and Polish as mieszczańcy. These were people of modest means, defined by law as owning less than 500 rubles in capital, a sum roughly equivalent to $250 of the time. Burghers were required to pay the head tax, a personal tax levied on individuals rather than property, and they were subject to corporal punishment, a stark reminder of their inferior legal status. Alongside them stood the artisans, craftsmen organized into trade guilds or unions, each profession administered separately. Every estate was registered, taxed, and governed according to its own rules, reinforcing rigid social boundaries. These administrative structures extended over newly annexed territories as well. One such region consisted of the governments of Chernigov and Novgorod-Seversk, later reorganized into the government of Poltava, together with part of the government of Kiev. Another area, which would much later become the government of Kovno in the year 1872, was at this time still included within the government of Vilna. Boundaries shifted, names changed, but for the populations living there, especially minorities, each reorganization carried new uncertainties. Promises made during conquest were not always honored. When the Russian Empire occupied the former Polish provinces after the final partition of Poland, it had pledged to respect existing rights and institutions. Yet these assurances were soon violated. In January of the year 1795, the Lithuanian Governor-General, Prince Nikolai Repnin, had replied to an appeal from Lithuanian Jewish communities. They asked that their traditional communal court, known as the Kahal Tribunal, be preserved. Repnin answered reassuringly that the Jews might retain the same rights they had enjoyed before the last Polish uprising of 1794. That promise, however, proved fragile, eroded by subsequent decrees and administrative decisions. Language itself reflected deep-rooted hostility. The Russian word commonly used for Jews, zhyd, originally derived from the Latin Judaeus through Slavic languages, had acquired a sharply derogatory tone in Russian usage. In Polish, by contrast, the same word carried no inherent insult, though more refined terms were preferred in polite conversation. Such linguistic shifts mirrored broader social attitudes and helped legitimize discriminatory policies. Economic privileges were another source of conflict. Among them was the system known as propination, the exclusive right of landowners to produce and sell alcohol on their estates, forcing peasants to buy liquor from their masters. This system had long enriched the nobility and fueled rural misery, yet it was fiercely defended as a traditional right. Ideas for regulating Jewish life did not emerge in isolation. The Russian statesman and poet Gavril Dyerzhavin openly admitted that he had borrowed many of his principal ideas from Prussian institutions. He was almost certainly referring to a set of Prussian regulations issued in the year 1797, known as the Jewish Regulation for South and New East Prussia. These laws governed Jewish life in the Polish territories that had fallen under Prussian rule and were widely discussed among administrators. There were numerous similarities between these Prussian measures and Dyerzhavin's proposals, revealing how policies toward Jews circulated across borders among the great powers that had divided Poland. Dyerzhavin's knowledge of Jewish institutions, however, was often superficial. In his writings, he referred to a supposed central Jewish authority using a misspelled version of the word Sanhedrin, rendered by him as Synhedrion. The Sanhedrin had been the supreme judicial and religious council of ancient Judaism in Jerusalem, long vanished by that time, but in the minds of some European officials it lingered as a shadowy symbol of Jewish autonomy and cohesion. Most revealing of all was the tone of Dyerzhavin's own reflections. In one passage of his opinion, he blended medieval suspicion with the language of Enlightenment paternalism. He wrote that supreme providence, pursuing its mysterious purposes, allowed the Jewish people to remain on earth despite what he called their dangerous characteristics, and refrained from destroying them. Therefore, he argued, the governments under whose scepter Jews sought refuge must also permit them to live. Yet this tolerance was not to be unconditional. Assisting what he called the decree of destiny, such governments were obliged to extend their patronage to the Jews only in such a way that they would prove useful both to themselves and to the surrounding population. In these words, mercy and menace stood side by side, foreshadowing policies that promised protection while demanding submission, and setting the stage for the struggles that were still to come. In the early years of the 19th century, a new wind began to stir through the gilded corridors and heavy wooden doors of the imperial capital, St. Petersburg. Alexander Pavlovich, soon to be crowned Alexander I of all the Russias, had ascended to the throne in the year 1801, bringing with him, at least in appearance, the promise of enlightened governance. This enlightened absolutism, as his advisers termed it, sought to infuse the machinery of the vast Russian Empire with a breath of reform. It was a delicate breeze, uncertain in its strength, yet enough to ruffle the dust of centuries-old bureaucracy, where clerks and senators labored without ever understanding the people whose lives they sought to regulate. Among those lives were the Jewish communities of the empire, communities whose very existence seemed, in the eyes of Russian officials, a puzzle to be solved, a problem to be contained, or a potential threat to be disciplined. For several years following the death of Emperor Paul I in the year 1801, the question of Jewish affairs remained largely dormant. The government itself was consumed with the monumental task of restructuring its own administration. The old Senate, which had once wielded considerable executive authority, was now stripped of much of its power. Ministries were established, a council of state was created to advise the sovereign, and the sprawling bureaucracy had to be reorganized. In the process, the vast dossiers and reports concerning Jewish life, compiled over the preceding decades, were transferred from the Senate to a new office, a fresh instrument of imperial oversight. In the month of November in the year 1802, by direct command of the Tsar, a special agency was instituted, the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews. Its name suggested kindness and improvement, yet beneath this polished veneer lay the familiar tension of suspicion and control. The members appointed to this committee were some of the most influential figures of the empire. Prince Alexander Dmitrievich Kochubey, the Minister of the Interior, held vast authority over the provinces and their administration. Gavril Romanovich Dyerzhavin, the former senator and inspector, now Minister of Justice, brought to the committee his detailed, if deeply biased, knowledge of Jewish communities. Count Platon Zubov, a figure whose influence at court was legendary, lent the weight of his favor to the deliberations. Two high officials of Polish birth completed the assembly: Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, Assistant Minister for Foreign Affairs and a close confidant of the Tsar, and Severin Potocki, a member of the Senate whose family lineage tied him to the historic nobility of the Polish lands. The committee's task was formidable. They were instructed to examine all the problems highlighted in Dyerzhavin's infamous memorandum concerning White Russia, where Jews had been accused of avarice and economic disruption. Their mission, it was said, was to extend the amelioration of the Jewish population to the other provinces recently acquired from Poland. Yet among the Jews of the Northwest, rumors of this committee spread like wildfire, igniting fear and anxiety. They had heard of Dyerzhavin's previous investigations, of the stringent measures he had imposed in White Russia, and of the allegations he had leveled against them. In the city of Minsk, the Kahal, the Jewish council responsible for communal governance, convened a special assembly in December of the year 1802. The Kahal resolved, with urgency and gravity, that it was necessary to act. The resolution declared that the 5 dignitaries now entrusted with Jewish affairs possessed powers to dispose of them as they see fit, and that it was imperative to petition the Tsar personally, imploring him not to allow the introduction of any innovations or alterations in their communal life. Funds were raised to support the journey of these delegates to St. Petersburg, and in an extraordinary act of spiritual preparation, the entire Jewish community imposed a fast of 3 days, offering prayers in synagogues across the province to avert the impending threat. When Prince Kochubey, the Minister of the Interior, became aware of the anxiety sweeping through the Jewish communities, he acted swiftly to mollify fears. In January of the year 1803, he issued a circular to the governors of all relevant provinces. The circular instructed them to assure the Kahals that the creation of the committee was not intended to diminish their rights, to curtail their privileges, or to infringe upon the substantial advantages they already enjoyed. On the contrary, the official wording promised, the committee's work aimed to improve conditions for the Jewish population, to offer them greater security and better treatment. Yet words alone could not calm the uncertainty and trepidation of the communities. The Jews of the Northwest had experienced enough arbitrary decrees and inspections to know that promises could be deceptive. What brought a measure of reassurance, however, was the action taken by the committee itself. In the opening months of the year 1803, the committee extended invitations to deputies from every gubernatorial Kahal, summoning them to St. Petersburg. The intent was to hear directly from these representatives about the needs and desires of their people, a significant departure from the customary routine of the imperial capital, where decisions were usually dictated in closed chancelleries, and where local voices were seldom consulted. This initiative marked the first, tentative step in a new, uncertain chapter of Russian-Jewish relations, one in which dialogue was, however cautiously, to supplement the relentless machinery of imperial control. In the deep winter of 1799, the first tremors of a new struggle began to be felt. But by the end of January, 1803, preparations were in full swing. The Kahals, the Jewish communal councils that had long governed Jewish life under the supervision of the state, were now arranging to send deputies to the capital. These were not ordinary travelers.